On this episode of Force Options Training Podcast, I talked to a doctor about the controversy surrounding the use of the term excited delirium. A reminder of our disclaimer: the opinions of the host and guests are theirs only, and not that of any agency they may have or currently work for. And as always, a big shout out to our sponsor, Wild Boar Social Club. Enjoy. Doctor, thank you for doing this today. If you could just give the listeners a little intro for yourself.
Yeah, hello, my name's Eric. I'm a physician, and I work in Western Canada, both in a medical capacity in a tertiary care trauma center, as well as with numerous police forces here in Western Canada.
Awesome. And I can confirm he is a doctor. He has a stethoscope and everything. So today we're here to talk about excited delirium. So the big thing is fact or fiction, because I think for most coppers, we're going to say fact.
Yeah, and I would agree. And I think the important thing is context is everything. So when we talk about excited delirium, for those of us who have been working in the field for many years, it elicits a very similar hair on your neck response. And so you've probably heard nowadays that there's a lot of discussion in both the medical fields as well as law enforcement about the validity of this. And I think it's really, really important to recognize that although we're grappling with the nomenclature, whatever it is, those of you who are on the front line every day, you know it. You know it to be real. You know it's a real entity. And it's one that poses a legitimate threat to the individual in crisis, to those who are responding, who are there to provide help, and to the public. And so while academics continue to deliberate on how to best approach this, it's important that we continue to recognize, in my opinion, that it's a legitimate entity, and that we continue to apply what we know as best practice to try to de-escalate and to mitigate these situations, and then provide best care as possible.
Excellent. So what was the big controversy surrounding it?
Well, there's a couple things. I would say that, when we talk about excited delirium, it's probably less has to do with the application of the term as opposed to the misapplication of the term. And that would include things like using it as a cause of death, because it doesn't exist technically as a bona fide diagnosis in the medical world. And there's different bodies of expertise that define different disease processes in the world, but none of them use the term excited delirium specifically. It's important to recognize that I'm not a pathologist. I'm not a medical examiner, so I don't want to delve too much into that. But what's more important from our lens as first responders is that the constellation of behaviors that these individuals present have a predictive nature to them. They have a predictive nature to suggest that if an individual is exhibiting these behaviors, that different use of force techniques may be less effective, that the individual is at greater potential risk to harm or bad outcomes, and that, generally speaking, that there is some other precipitant or concurrent medical issue that requires urgent attention. So what we're trying not to lose in moving forward is this predictive research, the observational data that has been gathered throughout North America, but led largely by a group in Canada with a federal research group, that it's demonstrated that if you identify these features, the more of them that there are, the greater likelihood of this entity and the increased need for a joint medical and police response. And the reason why I think this is important is that it's important not to brush away that we have to have physical command and control first. If those individuals aren't controlled, then medical personnel cannot provide the care that they need. And although that is sometimes distasteful or frowned upon by the lay people, I think it is often they don't appreciate the risks that are implicit with someone who is acting in this way. So the other point of controversy is that some narratives in the United States have suggested that the word excited delirium is used disproportionately in certain individuals of race, and that may have racial undertones, and or that police are using the term excited delirium as a justification for the use of excessive force. What's interesting is that if we were to apply an academic lens to this and look at the current studies and literature, that would not corroborate those allegations. Nevertheless, there are enough high-profile cases in the United States and in Canada now that warrant all of us to collectively reassess the term and look at some of the potential limitations to the term, which in fairness, now that I too have had to pause and reflect on it, there are limitations to using the term excited delirium.
And I like you touched on, we were obviously having that discussion ahead of time, and oftentimes it comes up and it's a controversy over, the excited delirium being the cause of death. And that's not the police that are making that. That would be the medical examiner or the coroner, depending on where you are.
Correct.
Yeah. And you touched a little bit, you'd mentioned the symptoms. So as terms of, don't get caught up on the actual terminology, but let's look at what symptoms we're dealing with. What would be some obvious symptoms that we...
So those symptoms haven't changed. So the previous constellation of signs or symptoms that have been discussed in use of force training when it comes to excited delirium are still really, really important to retain. So things like extremely aggressive or violent behavior, constant or near constant physical activity, not responding to police presence or reacting to bright lights or sounds, superhuman strength, being naked or inappropriately dressed for the environment, rapid breathing, so signs of autonomic arousal, so rapid breathing, profuse sweating, unintelligible animal-like sounds, intolerance to pain, excessive strength, as we've discussed. So basically someone who looks really, really jacked and is failing to respond to standard attempts at de-escalation.
Now, you talked about the term, the term being limiting. Some other new terms are being brushed around. I know for our American listeners, I know they have their American College of Emergency Physicians. They've created a different term, so they're calling it hyperactive delirium with severe agitation.
That's right.
What are we doing in Canada?
So we're still sorting that out in Canada. I think the principles that we want to espouse is to continue to focus on observable behavior and not anchor on a diagnosis where that diagnosis might be inaccurate or falsely way off. The important thing to acknowledge is that as first responders, when we're coming onto the scene of someone in distress, we are almost always responding with incomplete or partial information. So regardless of your qualifications, myself included, if I'm arriving in the field, I will not have the adequate information to come to a complete or reasonable diagnosis. And so by anchoring on a specific diagnosis on incomplete information, it's either inaccurate or sometimes we fail to consider other precipitating or exacerbating factors. So what we're trying to do is step back and encourage our membership to just take note of observable behavior. And then if those constellations of signs and symptoms that are consistent with the same criteria that we used to use to describe excited delirium, that we communicate that in such a way to our partner agencies, specifically our emergency medical services, to have a concurrent emergent response to help this individual in crisis. So the term that we are proposing in Canada is to align with other major groups in the United States is medical behavioral emergency. And the idea there is, first of all, medical as the first term is to prompt a reminder to our membership to, through dispatch or through whoever is able to assist, to elicit a concurrent emergent medical response, and that we come up with an appropriate and proportionate joint medical and law enforcement response to this individual. And then behavioral as a reminder that this is not a specific diagnosis. We're not trying to be doctors out there or psychiatrists or psychologists or medical examiners and labeling an individual, but simply using a broad term that is objective that just describes behaviors. And then we couple that with the word emergency, because one of the potential downsides to the term behavior is that we're not talking about people who are simply misbehaving, who could otherwise be de-escalated using standard CID techniques. We're talking about the other extreme of people who are not engaging in a normal fashion, so have disordered perception or disordered thought processes. And that extreme of behavior is what constitutes the emergency. So that triplet of medical, behavioral, emergency is a non-diagnostic term that in simple words can be equally understood between different agencies, both police and EMS, to elicit that same response, that heightened sense of urgency that we have historically attributed to excited delirium.
Yeah, and I think and hit it on the head in terms, and I think this is good, is the fact that we're police, we're not doctors, we're not psychologists, we're not, although we may say we are. And I'm sure, and if you watch FBI or CSI, the public expects us to be.
Or the rookie.
Yes, the rookie. That's right.
Get it solved in an hour with commercial breaks.
God, yeah. And then we can just come up and make that, just hit it right on the head, that diagnostic. So yeah, very important that I like where it's going on this. It's just like, hey, something's wrong here. Let's treat it as such, and let's recognize that it's not normal. And as we all know, CID takes two to be involved in that. Yeah. They have to be able to understand, to talk back to us. If we call CID talking, if we are doing that, they have to respond back. But in many of these cases, and most of us have dealt with it, they might not be responding back, or they're responding to something that doesn't even exist in reality. And
I think that's so important, because that concept of use of force has to be married to the medical intervention, because we can't provide medical care unless that individual's safely under control.
And now with that, what's some ways, if we come across something like this, I know in like my agency now, if we see something and we suspect that's what's happening, we're going to call not only paramedics, we're going to call for a higher level of paramedic, one that can administer narcotics if necessary.
Sedatives typically, yeah.
Sedatives, yeah. So what any suggestions that we'd have for when we're dealing with this?
Well, honestly, I think the training paradigms in the past haven't been wrong. I think they've gotten it right. And if you look at, the observational data that we have that demonstrates the predictive nature of these constellation of symptoms, we need to hang on to that. So we need to keep training our colleagues to look out for those key constellations of symptoms that would suggest this medical behavioral emergency, but then to simultaneously urgently request a medical response.
Excellent. Well, anything that you think we haven't really touched on that I think is important for the member out there, the one that's working tonight that might go across and deal with someone in this situation?
No, other than, as we kind of fumble through on the academic side how to find the right term and to publicize it, what's most important is communication. And regardless of what uniform you're wearing, make sure you have that shared, explicit knowledge that we're on the same page, that we have the same ground truth as to what's happening and what you're concerned about, and use whatever means you have to communicate that to your partner agencies until on our end we can sort out that term and publicize it appropriately.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time. I don't want to keep you any longer than I have to, and thanks again for coming on. Yeah. And hopefully we'll have you again.